A stunning statement from a federal judge just today that Nazis were treated better than the Venezuelan nationals the Trump administration deported to El Salvador. That came in a pivotal hearing that ended just a few moments ago. A three-judge panel at the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals heard arguments in the government's effort to resume deportations under the Alien Enemies Act. The Justice Department coming under withering questioning at times on whether the government moved so fast in deporting more than 200 people to a prison camp in El Salvador that they were denied their rights. Take a listen to Judge Patricia Millett.
There were no procedures in place to notify people. Nazis got better treatment under the Alien Enemy Act than has happened here, where the proclamation required the promulgation of regulations, and they had hearing boards before people were removed. And yet here there's nothing in there about hearing boards, there's no regulations, and nothing was adopted by the agency officials that were administering this. People weren't given notice, they weren't told where they were going, and they were given, those people on those planes on that Saturday had no opportunity to file habeas or any type of action to challenge the removal under the AEA. And like you've agreed that two of those airplanes, people were removed under the AEA. What's factually wrong about what I said?
Again, according to the judge, Nazis got better treatment than people sent to El Salvador, many of whom deny any connection to Tren de Aragua, a violent gang that originated in Venezuela. Just hours before today's hearing, federal judge James Boasberg dealt the Trump administration another blow, refusing to lift his own order barring deportations under the Alien Enemies Act. The judge saying, in effect, that when the government says that someone is a gang member and can be deported, they have the right to prove that they are not. Quote, before they may be deported, they are entitled to individualized hearings to determine whether the act applies to them at all. As the government itself concedes, the awesome power granted by the act may be brought to bear only on those who are, in fact, alien enemies. But not only have many of the Venezuelan nationals deported to El Salvador denied that they are who the government says they are, there are questions about whether the Alien Enemies Act even applies to the actual gang. Here's National Security Advisor Mike Waltz.
The Alien and Sedition Act fully applies because we have also determined that this group is acting as a proxy of the Maduro regime. So
I'm sorry, just to clarify on that. This is supposed to apply if the U.S. is at war with a country. You are saying you have evidence that the government of Venezuela is directing these gangs?
We are saying that TDA is acting as a proxy of the Maduro regime.
Not so fast. Officials tell the New York Times that, quote, the intelligence community assessment concluded that the gang, TDA, was not directed by Venezuela's government or committing crimes in the United States on its orders. Analysts put that conclusion at a moderate confidence level, the official said, because of a limited volume of available reporting about the gang. Most of the intelligence community, including the CIA and the National Security Agency, agreed with that assessment. And that is where we start today with MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin, plus NBC News correspondent and executive producer of Separated, Jacob Soboroff, and former Democratic Senator and MSNBC political analyst Claire McCaskill. It is good to see you all. Lisa, break down for us what happened today.
So, Alicia, today was an argument about certain issues in the case, but not others. So let's first set the table about what it wasn't about. It wasn't about whether the president lawfully used the Alien Enemies Act or whether, for example, it applies in peacetime. It wasn't about that. It wasn't about whether the Trump administration has violated the orders that Judge Boasberg set into place. And it certainly wasn't about what the remedy is for that. The question here today was, does a court have any role when a president invokes the Alien Enemies Act through a proclamation and then takes action to implement it, as the Trump administration did with those two flights of alleged Venezuelan migrants who are members of Tren de Aragua? And today you heard two very different interpretations of that. You heard the administration saying, really, there is no role for the court here to play unless and until those who have already been placed in custody bring what's called a habeas petition. That's a fancy way of saying a petition for their release from U.S. custody. Then you had the plaintiffs, represented by Legal Learns of the ACLU, saying that can't be the only way that we can contest this. People are entitled to an individualized determination of whether or not they are, in fact, members of Tren de Aragua, which is what you were talking about at the top. But it wasn't a question, for example, of whether or not we are at war with the Venezuelan government, whether Tren de Aragua is an extension of the Venezuelan government. And I think the most interesting part of all of this came at the end when Judge Patricia Millett, who you just quoted with that respect to saying that Nazis were treated better than some of the Venezuelans here, really forced the government to acknowledge the government was in complete control of who was on the plane. And she asked them, given that, aren't these people entitled to some form of notice and a chance to contest that they are who you say they are before you deport them to El Salvador and put them in a notorious Salvadoran prison? And the answer, of course, the government was kind of trying to weave around it, but eventually he finally conceded, if you lifted this TRO, yes, there would be no limitations on what we could do. We would be within our rights to start these plane flights immediately again, and we could pack more Venezuelan migrants who are alleged members of Tren de Aragua on a plane before they could even file a habeas petition or anything else. And that's a chilling thing for the government to acknowledge. But of course, that is exactly what they want to do and why they want the TRO lifted.
There were many chilling elements of today, Jacob. I want you to take a listen to what Legal Learned from the ACLU, someone who featured prominently in your documentary, Separated, had to say in court.
We're talking about people being sent to El Salvador, one of the worst prisons in the world, incommunicado. They're essentially being disappeared. The president of El Salvador has now said maybe they're going to spend the rest of their lives there. The government has provided zero ability to bring habeases.
Essentially being disappeared, Jacob, you have reported on one of the darkest periods of American history. It feels as though we are now living through an extension of that cruelty.
I'm glad that you drew the parallel, Alicia, to family separation and pointed out that Legal Learned was the head lawyer for the ACLU that stopped that policy and won the reunification of those 5,500 kids that were deliberately taken from their parents. I think to understand this chapter of American history and what the Trump administration is doing to Venezuelans who are inside the United States by accusing them of being in this gang, TDA, you have to go back and remember family separation, why it was such a big deal, why so many people rose up around the world, and why ultimately President Trump himself stopped the policy. The judge that ended the policy in that case that Legal Learned argued was a Republican-appointed judge, Dana Sobran, in the Southern District of California. He called the family separation policy one of the most shameful chapters in the history of our country. And the reason that he called it that was because, in his words, it shocked the conscience. It shocked the conscience of the American people. Also a parallel drawn by Lindsay Toslowski from Immigrant Defenders Law Center out here in California, who represents one of the Venezuelans that's now sitting in that El Salvadorian prison, was that there was no due process. The families that were separated by the Trump administration, ripped apart from one another in what Physicians for Human Rights and the American Academy of Pediatrics both called torture and government-sanctioned child abuse, they were ripped apart without the ability to plead their case to the U.S. government. There was no due process in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the judge, in the eyes of the ACLU that argued that case. And that is what you are hearing here, that people are being picked up. You mentioned the word disappeared, rendered to another country, just like children were rendered unaccompanied during the family separation crisis. They didn't show up here without their parents. They were being stolen from them. And there is no backstop. There was no backstop to injustice perpetrated by the United States government in that case. And what Legal Learned and the ACLU was arguing is there are parallels here as well. Those children couldn't argue to the United States government, don't take me from my parents. And the Venezuelans that are sitting in that prison in El Salvador couldn't either.